If there is a God, why are there natural disasters? It's a big question. It's a question many of us will have asked. It's a question many of us will have been asked and have struggled with. And today I'm here with Sharon Dirckx, and she's just published a book called Broken Planet. If there is a God, then why are there natural disasters and diseases? My name's Charlie Stiles from OCCA, the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics. And this organisation exists to tackle questions exactly like this. And so it's great to be with my colleague and friend Sharon as we tackle this topic and find out more about her book. So Sharon, why don't you just tell us a bit about yourself?
Thank you. It's great to be here. My name is Sharon Dirckx. I come from a background in brain imaging, have a PhD in that area, but now I spend time as a speaker and author thinking about the difficult questions that people ask about the Christian faith and how we might respond.
So you've written this book, big topic, current I suppose in any generation, but perhaps particularly with some of the things that we've seen in recent years, the pandemic, some of the earthquakes and things that really do fill our news screen and really touch our hearts. Could you perhaps though explain a bit about why you decided to write a book on this topic and where you started from?
Well, it's great to be here and to talk about Broken Planet. Actually, the project itself came out of an earlier book where I also addressed the question of suffering, and I did so by combining apologetic arguments with stories of people who have suffered in very deep ways and yet have managed to hold to belief in a loving God even in the midst of tragedy. But in the process of writing that book, it occurred to me that there's a whole lot more that we could say about natural disasters and diseases. These are illnesses and forms of suffering that seem to come from the forces of nature, whether they are the geophysical world, in terms of earthquakes and tsunamis and so on, or whether they are coming from our very biology in the case of disease and sickness. And so I felt the need to write a book that really looked into that kind of suffering, but with the same pattern as the earlier book, so using stories. And so what I do in Broken Planet is I kind of look at lots of different kinds of natural disaster, because we can't really have a one-size-fits-all approach to it. There are lots of different kinds. And so I look at earthquakes, hurricanes, tsunamis, wildfires, pandemics, locust infestations, and so on. And I also look at people with stories connected to all of those kinds of disaster.
In the midst of that, you seem to trace sort of natural disasters, these natural factors, but also you bring in human factors as well. How do those sort of things play out in the sort of disasters and diseases you're talking about?
Yeah, a great question. One of the points that I make in the book is that actually there's no such thing as a 100% natural disaster. Any natural event that we see in the world is usually a complex combination of human factors and natural factors. In fact, one view that is kind of put forward is that the problem isn't with nature itself. The problem is with our relationship and interaction with nature, and that we've actually become vulnerable to the natural world. Yeah.
That was something really helpful, I think, for me, was understanding that there are certain things going on in the world, what you might call sort of natural processes and change, and whether that's sort of geothermic sort of things or whatever. Yeah. And then what humanity has done in that context then impacts suffering.
Yeah.
Could you just play that out a bit? Maybe give us an example.
Yeah. So this view is essentially saying, look, the fact that we have natural disasters is kind of the flip side of living in a world that can sustain itself. So a lot of the mechanisms underlying, for example, earthquakes, tectonic plate activity is used to recycle nutrients from deep beneath the Earth's crust back to the surface. Volcanic activity releases pressure back into the atmosphere. Even flooding brings nutrients further inland. And so lots of these cataclysmic events seem to have life-sustaining mechanisms or play a vital role in sustaining life on Earth. And the fact that we get caught up in them is kind of the flip side of living in that kind of world. But what seems to happen is that human activity can often make it worse, and often quite a lot worse. And so two of the key things that I draw out in the book are poverty and climate change. So with the poverty, if you look at the number of deaths in a country of high income after a natural disaster and compare it with the number of deaths in a country of low income, what you see is in the low-income country, several orders of magnitude higher numbers of people suffer and die. And very often the undergirding reason for that is poverty, which often makes it more likely that there's going to be corner cutting and corruption in society and so on. So, for example, if you compare the Californian 1987 earthquake with Haiti 2010, they're both sort of similar strength, and hundreds of thousands died in Haiti. And part of the reason for that was, again, people living in high-density housing that just pancaked in the wake of the earthquake. But even things like luxury hotels did that because they hadn't been built with the necessary steel rods that if you look at, skyscrapers in Japan, they just sway when there's an earthquake, or often do. But in Haiti, they just were disintegrated. And so people died that didn't need to have died. We also saw this in Turkey and Syria in 2023. And so people die unnecessarily because of human inaction or negligence, or because of inequality and structural inequality that exists in the world.
Were there any particular stories that really hit home to you, or that illustrated what it might mean to face those kind of situations, the natural disasters with natural factors, or perhaps things that are consequences of human behaviour? Were there particular stories that brought that to a focus for you?
I think for me, the stories themselves, if you like, they were an apologetic in and of themselves as well. So part of what I was trying to do was show that unfathomable tragedy can happen, and somehow people that are caught up in it can find a way to walk through that with God. Not that there are kind of neat and tidy answers. One of the stories in the book is from Haiti 2010, and of people that were killed in that earthquake. Gathering these stories, hearing what people have gone through, pushed me to the limits of what I believe to be true. For example, one story is from a mother whose 3 grown-up children, who were all Christians, who were actually all killed in the Haiti 2010 earthquake. And I think what was made even harder for her was that they had got a boat over to the mainland 2 days earlier than they would have done otherwise, because they could get a ride across without needing to pay. And they didn't have very much money, so that seemed like a good idea. And of course, this mother really wrestled with the fact that her children died as a result of that decision. And, this, really causes us to kind of realise that tidy theology and feeling like we've got it all kind of packed up neatly and we can understand why these things happen, that's not the kind of world that we live in. We do live with mess, we do live with mystery, but somehow God is in it. He's in the midst of the mess. And we know that because, we believe in a God who has come to be with us. He hasn't just sent us information or instructions. So yeah, it wasn't a neat and tidy project. It was messy. The
stories really seem to bring that out, I think, really helpfully, that this isn't just a really, clever and rational argument. And, you have a background as a scientist, there are all these kind of logical things, but this reality of the story. And I thought what was interesting was in the midst of it, you were giving some explanations, you were giving some of the different factors and the way they play off, but there was also this element of mystery. In terms of the kind of how this plays out, how do we, or how do you, embrace that sense of mystery, our ignorance, our lack of answers in the face of some of these questions?
I think part of it is kind of having a posture of compassion towards people and saying, look, we don't have all of the answers. There are some things that we can say that help us frame the question, at least make some sense of why we feel so raw and angry about it. I mean, one of the most helpful things that we can say is that, look, if God doesn't exist, what kind of explanations do you have available? And mostly we lean on scientific or geophysical, genetic explanations, which are needed and necessary, but actually they tell us that these are just events. There's nothing right or wrong about them. But why do we refer to them as disasters? Why do we fight cancer? You know, there's something about us that wants to rail against events in the natural world. Well, why is that? And actually, we perceive these things as wrong. We call them disasters, and to do that is to make a moral judgment. And how do we make best sense of that? Is it that, you know, we somehow have these moral intuitions about the world randomly, but we actually in reality live in a non-moral universe? Or is it that we've actually always lived in a moral universe because God is good, but that universe, that world has somehow gone wrong? And that actually makes more sense of our rawness and anger and grief than if God doesn't exist. So there are some things that we can say, but of course we can't say everything, and we need to have a posture of humility. And of course the stories themselves I found to be a way to address mystery. Some of the stories in the book were quite open-ended in how they were concluded. It wasn't that, you know, it didn't have a neat and tidy ending, and I guess that gets at some of the mystery. People's lives go on, they've gone through tragedy, but they continue on, and God loves them, and God is at work, but it wasn't neatly concluded.
And one of the more tricky subjects, not that anything in the book is that easy, but one of the more tricky things that you begin to kind of push into is this idea that people think that the suffering or tragedy that they experience might be a form of punishment from God. Obviously, that's a really sensitive issue. How do you kind of begin to navigate that question?
Yeah, I think it's really important that very often many people that don't believe in God, if trouble comes, very often, if they're going to think about God, it's often in the framework of, has God done this to me? Is there something that I've done to deserve it? And I think that it's really something that I feel very strongly that we need to be so clear on when we're talking to people that are not sure what they believe, is that God doesn't single people out for punishment like some sort of divine lightning bolt from heaven to an individual to teach them a lesson or make them change their ways. We suffer because we live in a broken world. We live on a broken planet that is kind of broken on a global scale, and we're all caught up in that brokenness, be it through what's happening physically or what's happening, you know, in terms of how we treat each other. But that doesn't mean that it's kind of a personal punishment from God, nor a form of judgment on a region or nation for some sin that they have committed. In fact, the closest that we come to seeing Jesus respond to this is in a passage in Luke where there's been a tower in Shiloh that fell on a group of people. And Jesus asks the question to his listeners, do you think that those people were any worse sinners than anyone else because this has happened to them? And he said, I tell you no, but unless you repent, you too will perish. In other words, when we hear of a natural disaster, or even of someone struggling with sickness or illness, it ought not to cause us to pronounce judgment on that person or on that region or situation, but actually for us to cast our gaze inwards to assess our own spiritual position. How will we respond to the person of Jesus Christ, who has said that he is actually the way to the Father, and there is life and forgiveness in him? And it's also a reminder that this is not a form of judgment from God, but there is a day when there will be judgment from God. There will be justice. God isn't indifferent about the horrible things that we do to each other in this world, and we will be called to account for that. And so it's not a judgment from God, but a reminder that one day there will be a day when we are reckoned and asked to respond for our lives. And so that's quite a sobering thought in response to that question.
You, again, as you mentioned, the kind of the natural factors of the world and the human factors, but you know, you do talk about inequality and poverty, and you do talk about climate change. So these are things that we have actively done, or perhaps through neglect have failed to do. They are perhaps at times moral decisions. Where would you see the appropriateness of the term kind of evil or wrongness in terms of how we talk about this kind of massive topic?
What I also do, I present kind of two views in the way that I think about this. So one is the natural human factors, and then the other view is the spiritual factors. Those natural and human factors are definitely part of it, and I don't think there's a kind of just one way of answering this question. But I also believe that there are spiritual factors. Christians believe that spiritual factors have led to kind of brokenness in nature and biology. And of course, there are different views and opinions on how they think that has happened. Some people would kind of relate it to the kind of brokenness between early humans and God, and that has somehow dragged nature along with it. Others would say actually nature itself perhaps became broken before humans did, and actually tie it more to an angelic brokenness, an angelic fall that predates the human fall. Either way, the conclusion is that there is a spiritual dimension, that there are forces of evil that are woven into the very fabric of our world, not simply the human heart. There's kind of different layers to the kind of brokenness. And the Apostle Paul, in his letter to the church in Rome, talks about nature being in a state of groaning and frustration and almost like creaking. And one of my stories of an earthquake in South America, she literally thought she could hear the earth take a breath in the aftermath of this massive earthquake. And, this letter to the church in Rome captures a little bit of that nature is not at peace with itself. It's in frustration and groaning and creaking, and there's more to come. It's not finished. And so I think that there are spiritual explanations as well that sit alongside the natural and the human explanations.
Because that language of broken and brokenness does seem to have some sort of moral dimension of things have gone wrong. That point that you make, which is that you need some explanation for why things are the way they are, and if you want to call something a disaster, you need some reason why it's a disaster, why it's bad, rather than just an event.
Yes.
To what extent would you be understanding that as part of the consequence of these spiritual factors, this spiritual fall, where it says that the world is subjected to this groaning, to this kind of tension?
I think that again there are different views out there. I guess where I land is the fact that we call anything moral in the first place. I would sit broadly in the sense that we live in a moral universe and we're made by a good God. And so part of what it means to be made in the image of God is that we have that kind of imprint on us as well, that we have moral sentience, that we are aware of right and wrong. So I would sort of situate that in the fact that we live in a moral universe, that we've had that kind of the image of God imprinted upon us, that we can make those judgments.
So you talk about a broken planet, that there is the image of God in us, and that gives us this value, which means that when these things happen, they are disastrous. They're not just events that happen. Where do we go with that? If we say that we believe in God, which I do, in the face of that, where do we go?
Yeah, I think something really unique that the Christian faith has to say about disasters and diseases is that even though we don't understand everything, God hasn't left us alone in our suffering. He didn't just send us instructions about how to cope with disease or disaster. He actually came down to be with us in our suffering, to walk with us, to journey with us, and then through that to actually do something about it. And extraordinarily, right at the heart of the Christian faith is a God who has suffered like us and for us. The fact that he's suffered at all is one thing. He knows what it's like to be human, but he's also suffered in ways that go way beyond anything that we can imagine. And he's done that to rescue us so that when we suffer, we never need to be suffering on our own. Jesus carried, if you like, the world's evil on our behalf, all of the evil that we are capable of, past, present and future, took that upon himself so that evil doesn't have to have the last word in our lives, so that whatever the disasters we face, we can always know the presence of God with us through it. Sometimes that's the only thing that we might feel like we have to offer to someone that is going through a deep tragedy, that there's a God that loves them, that knows them, that has died so that they need never suffer on their own. And that's really at the heart of the Christian faith.
Hey guys, how are we doing? My name's Nadia and I'm part of OCCA, the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics. And we just want to say thank you for watching our video. At OCCA, we love to look into the big questions facing our time and our culture to see how the Christian faith gives answers that are both rational and rich in their understanding. If you enjoyed this video and you want to come along with us, then why not check out the rest of the content on this channel? Please consider subscribing and following as well, so that we can keep on making content like this. We really want to hear from you guys, so if you have ideas of questions that we can look into or content that we can make, then please drop a comment down below or get in touch with us directly. We want to say thank you as well to the speakers, to the donors, to the filmmakers, and also to you guys for making it happen. You know, it takes about 60 hours to create a film like this, and that's because we want it to be carefully researched. We want the talk to flow beautifully, and we want the filmmaking to be smooth. But that all takes time. And here at OCCA, our staff are funded by people who share our vision. So if you want to partner with the work that we are doing, please consider donating. I'll catch you next time.